So thank you very much for speaking with me, Abbie, who is the very talented author of The Ends of the Earth, which I absolutely adored reading, and I did shed a few tears at the end. So I'm very grateful to speak to you about your experience writing it, the reception you've had from it, etc. Before we get into the book, can you tell us a bit about what you were doing before? So I'm aware that you were a literary agent before. How was that kind of process working in publishing?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It was definitely a big part of kind of my journey as a writer. So to go back to the beginning, after I graduated, I really didn't know what to do, but I knew I love reading, which is kind of the one thing you need in publishing. Do you love reading? Tick. And I was struggling with work experience in publishing because at the time it was all unpaid, and I needed to kind of be paid. And someone mentioned literary agencies paid minimum wage, but it was like enough to get a foot in. And so I started applying for internships with a few, and I was lucky enough to get a position at Curtis Brown, who represents so many people. David Nichols, Jojo Moyes, John le Carré, like their client list is just like a book lover's dream. And I did 3 months interning there, and it was a case of just being in the right place at the right time when an assistant job came up. And I worked with a brilliant agent called Sheila Crowley for 3 years. And during that time, she was so generous with her knowledge and expertise, and she allowed me to start agenting some of my own projects, primarily non-fiction, like kind of self-help, which I love. That's kind of something I read a lot of, not what I write, but what I read a lot of. So that was what I was doing. And it was at that time, I suppose some people say, did you always know you wanted to be an author? And honestly, I didn't. I knew I loved storytelling. I knew I loved writing. And as I said, books were everything. But it felt kind of magical, like who were authors? I didn't know any authors. Not my friendly neighbourhood author. I didn't have one. So it was actually through being at the agency that I saw where kind of books came from without that sounding totally silly. You saw that even the most amazing authors in the world have first drafts, that, publishers work on books so much. So I thought, well, maybe I could just try and write a novel. And then one day I had the idea for my first novel, The Silent Treatment. And I just thought, this is the sort of novel I think I could try and get 80,000 words down for. And that was really my only aim, was just to try to write something novel-like. Maybe I'd hate it, but I didn't hate writing it. And once I had those 80,000 words, I'm sure you know this aspect of life, you set yourself a new goal. So the new goal was maybe I'll find an agent. And then the new goal after that was maybe we'll find a publisher. So that was my segue in. And then when I was lucky enough to get a 2-book deal from Penguin in the UK for The Silent Treatment and The Ends of the Earth, at that stage it just happened to correspond with me relocating out of London. So since then I've been freelance writing in various guises. So that's my journey from kind of agency to authoring. And yeah, it was a really amazing opportunity and experience, and I'm grateful for where it's kind of got me now.
Yeah, it sounds it. And the kind of myth that a lot of people that don't work in publishing always think is when you work at a literary agency, you're just reading all day long. That's obviously not true, and we wish it were true. What can you sort of summarise what you were sort of doing on a day-to-day basis?
That's such a good question. Yes, I wish we read all day. Generally, when I came into work, I might be reading something on my commute, a client has delivered their new manuscript, or you've called in a manuscript by an author and you want to read the whole thing. But once I hit my desk, you just go through your emails. I used to get a lot overnight because we had a US colleague, so I might have to go through sort of 80 or 100 emails. A lot of them were just for reference. Maybe there were 20 that needed actioning. So I'd sort of write those tasks down along with other tasks in the background. So chasing up contracts, going through royalty statements, updating the website, doing social media for all our clients, maybe coming up with kind of campaigns to promote their books in tandem with the publishers. We might work with our rights colleagues to see whether they can sell a book in Germany or Romania. We might share the script with the film team to see whether they think they might get a production deal. We might work with our creative writing students to kind of, teach them how to make a pitch letter or something. So it's super varied. And there was, of course, reading all the submissions from aspiring authors, as well as the manuscripts from existing clients. And that was a huge part of the job. But I think for most people in publishing, that falls outside of the 9 to 5. So your commute reading, maybe a bit in the evening, maybe on weekends. There were definitely points where it feels quite overwhelming, if you've got in a great way, because obviously, you know, everyone wants to read great stories, great characters, but it's hard to get that kind of balance between your work and your home life. I think a lot of people in publishing say that, and agents, really top agents, are like always on from like, you know, round the clock. It's so impressive, and yeah, it was such a varied job, like never a dull day. I would definitely say that too.
So you went from sort of working and being surrounded by these agents, and then you had to find one yourself. How was that experience? Did you have a kind of, you know, a head start as such? All these kind of aspiring authors, what's your kind of advice? How did it happen?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think the main thing that my job was useful for was just kind of teaching the information that I should say is like all available online now. Like, it is very accessible now, and it's getting more and more accessible. So how to write a pitch letter. Obviously, I read a lot of pitch letters, so you know what doesn't work, you know what does work. That information, like if you Google it, you know, you'll find it. But I suppose I learned it kind of firsthand without Googling it. Likewise with the synopsis, a gripping first 3 chapters. I think the main thing was just so much material, so many books, you know, coming out there. Say you want to write like a crime thriller, which I love crime thrillers. It's like, what's going to make yours different? And what we talk about in publishing a lot, like, as I'm sure you know so well, is the hook. Like, what is the hook of this book? Like, if you had to sort of describe this novel in a sentence, what is it? So I think I really learned how important that is, because you can write the best ever prose, the best ever characters, but if like you don't actually know what's going on in your book, it's going to be very hard to get a publisher to buy the book. So I suppose that was the main thing I learned. But in terms of finding an agent, I just went at it like anyone else would. I think being in the industry, there were like a few agents who I knew looked after the sort of books I looked after. Like, for example, if you're writing sort of general contemporary fiction like I am, don't send it to somebody who just does sci-fi. Don't send it to someone who only wants historical novels, you know, so that sort of thing. But other than that, I did it all under a pseudonym as well. Like, I was very conscious that I wanted like a dividing line between like what I did in the day and what I did in the mornings and the evenings. So it's a wild ride. But one thing I should say is, like, for anyone who is an aspiring author, like, really just suck up everything that's on the internet. Like, all the agents' guidelines are there. There's so much brilliant material on YouTube, Instagram, everywhere. Like, I think like a lot of good work has been done to kind of demystify the process of all of that. And yeah, tenacity is the other main thing. Like, you're going to get rejected constantly, so just, you kind of get sad and then you shrug it off. And
you know. But you get there, and you're living proof of that you can have published books. So congrats, because I'm sure it is a bit of a, you know, sluggish process. So let's move on to the actual book that we're talking about today, The Ends of the Earth. Where did you get the idea from the story from? So for anyone that hasn't read this yet, which I really recommend you do, how do I explain it? It's about a character whose husband kind of just goes off the face of the earth, and she's like, where's he gone? She stands outside Ealing Station with this sign saying, come home, Jim, for sort of 7 years. This, you know, everyone kind of thinks she's crazy, you know, give up, etc. And it's kind of this mission with this journalist to go and find out what the hell happened to Jim. Where did you get all them ideas from?
Oh, thank you. I mean, when you say it like that, it's like, whoa, so much going on in this book in a good way. Because at the time, often when you're writing, it's like, okay, are these just random juggling balls? Yeah. My original idea came when I was working in the literary agency. I was commuting every day from South London into Central. And it feels like very strange describing this in that sort of pandemic world, but it used to be frenetic, the commute, you know, like honestly no breathing space trying to get through the concourse. And I just had this idea, like, what if someone was just stood there refusing to move on, like refusing to move on. All these ideas were swirling in my mind, and then I was like, okay, what would attract attention about this person other than the fact they were static? And it was this idea of a sign, and those were like the original, those was kind of, so I knew it was going to be about a woman with a sign outside a train station. And then I sort of forget this process when I need a new idea because I'm quite impatient, but it just kind of percolates. So for a while I knew there was a woman with a sign, but I was trialing something in my mind, different storylines, but eventually like pieces click and you think, no, that interests me enough, or that has enough legs. So the commute was really fruitful in terms of ideas for this book.
I can imagine, because you're surrounded by so many people as well and different characters that I'm sure even that kind of plucks ideas when you're sitting next to someone that's like a bit different to you, that kind of plucks character ideas. So can you share some of what the other ideas were? So we know now that the sign says "Come home, Jim." Did you have any other kind of drafts of what that sign could have said?
The sign stayed fairly constant, "Come home, Jim." I think also like the song, I remember sort of listening to the song "That Man That Can't Be Moved" by The Script. But I didn't really want a man who couldn't be moved. I felt that felt like too cliche, and often I feel like if an idea is going too cliche, I just kind of like invert it. There might be like a simple inversion, so that was like a gender inversion. I had some various ideas for like where Mary would be. I didn't always have her in London. I had her in Belfast, which is where she's actually from. Then I knew I wanted it to be like in a sort of big city. So, if a reader picks us up in Hong Kong or New York, everyone knows London and they have like an image of it. And the train and tube stations are so iconic in London. They're kind of artwork, which is sort of on the cover. Yeah. On the back, it's kind of got a bit. So, I played around with locations a lot. The sign never changed. I had a few ideas, like what might have happened to Jim. But again, like I often know when something doesn't work and it takes you a while to work out where, what does click. But when it does, I can kind of feel it. Like it kind of works. So, yeah. Yeah,
perfect. And my next question is about Mary, who is the main character, who's kind of in a way grieving for her missing Jim. So she doesn't know if he's dead or alive, but in a way she's kind of grieving. And you've kind of already answered this, but I wanted to ask what made you choose that as her main coping mechanism for grief. People deal with grief in very different ways, but that seemed to me like her coping mechanism of it. People were telling her to give up sort of thing and she carried on. Do you think that plays like a big part? Why do you choose that as a kind of coping mechanism for Mary?
Yeah, it's such an interesting and such a thought-provoking question. And I feel it's probably a question that like book clubs could get a lot out of. I think we do associate grief with being very personal. And Mary, this isn't a spoiler by any means, you'd find it out on page 1. She's very introverted, personal. So for her, this is a huge step. So when she does this public, it's almost kind of like a vigil. I initially was kind of imagining it as a vigil. It's a very big step for her, and I think it shows so many of her qualities. Despite her stepping out of her comfort zone to do this vigil, it shows so many of the values that she holds dear: constancy, loyalty, fidelity, patience, the extent of kind of our love for other people. And these ideas were kind of all brought together in the sign. I also the sign felt really pertinent to me insofar as we're completely bombarded with visuals nowadays, aren't we? Like social media and the internet. And the sign's kind of like the OG, isn't it? It's like the original visual that we've had since medieval times. So she's like stripping everything back. Like when we strip everything away, what's there? And this isn't a spoiler, this happens very early on into the book, but Mary's sign gains some online traction. And it was really interesting to go from sort of, here's a woman who's painted something on a piece of cardboard, and suddenly when it falls into the world's glare, how do people change what the sign looks like? So I think it was a really like variable, versatile device in the story, and I think it also showed up a lot of elements of Mary's character too. Yeah, 100%, and that's such a good point. Like grief or whatever, something traumatic happens like this, we kind of change in a way, and like you were saying, she develops a lot more patience. She steps outside of her comfort zone, and I love what you're saying about stripping it back to kind of like the bare basics, because as you mentioned, there's like hashtags going around and stuff, and she could have done that initially herself, but she chose to use the sign, which I found personally really interesting. So James and Mary, and this shouldn't be a spoiler, but on their second date, James asks Mary what's her end goal, e.g. what's the thing that she like dreams about when she's working her 9 till 5, what does she want to achieve at the end? And I loved this, and I've been asking this to like my parents and my boyfriend and everything, because I thought it was such a unique, and I don't know, I just love that idea. So more of a personal question, what is your end goal? This has given me a lot of food for thought. And actually, when you were like, when you brought this kind of like part of the story out, I was like, oh, I'd almost forgotten about that, even though it's really important in the novel. And actually, I think I'm going to say I disagree with Jim. I believe we all have an end goal, but I actually think we have end goals. And I think a big issue that both Mary and Jim have in the novel is that they think there is kind of only one end goal. Whereas actually I think it's kind of dangerous to have just one, and that you need to be like fulfilled in all aspects of your life. So for me professionally, the end goal, I hope, is to be able to keep doing what I'm doing, telling stories. Novels are what I'm writing right now, but to kind of tell stories in all their guises, and to write stories that entertain and engage and create thought, and just to keep reaching new readers. That's a big end goal for me as well. I love it when people say like, oh, this is the first book, like, I've only written 2 books, but it's the second book I've read, but now I really want to read your first book, The Silent Treatment. I just absolutely love that. So to keep reaching new readers. And then personally, I to have a better balance between my work and my home life, and to spend more time with, I'm very fortunate to have lots of people in my life who light it up. That sounds very, very sweet. I don't mean that, but, you know, the reason you get out of bed in the morning, really, and to spend more proper time with them all. So, I suppose that's 2 end goals. But I love that you picked that up. I should start asking more people as well. It's really telling, isn't it?
For sure, no, and I love your answers. And just kind of while we're sort of talking about books and stuff, one I read recently, I don't have it with me, it's called Your Work Wellness Toolkit. It's written by someone called Eleanor M. Bard. It's published by Watkins, and I love it. It's got a lot of kind of CBT, so cognitive behavioural therapy in it, and it is like what you're saying. It's about having a balance between your work and your sort of personal life. But and I read it at a time where I didn't think that I needed to improve my sort of work well-being, and actually I read it thinking I'm doing so much wrong. So I really recommend that, because there's 100 tips in it, so it's like 100 pages long, and each page is like a new tip to improve your work well-being. And there's some little things, but there's some big ideas, all very practical. 10 out of 10, recommend.
Okay, that sounds amazing. So I'm actually writing this down. Now I'm kind of going on the Work Wellbeing Toolkit.
Your Work Wellness Toolkit, Ellen M. Bard, and it's published by Watkins. It actually only came out this January, so yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Is it the sort of book that you think, you know, some books you feel like you should own them in physical because there's like writing space, or you read it on Kindle? Would it be?
I would recommend reading it as a physical copy, because there are spaces in it, there are boxes to write, etc. It's more like a journal. Okay, cool. So yeah, and there are questions that it kind of invites you to take away and write on your own notepad. But I would recommend getting a physical copy, just because there are those dedicated boxes, etc. Yeah.
That sounds brilliant. I think, you know, it's interesting, like, I've had a strange experience in that kind of both my novels have come out in the various stages of pandemic, and then like it puts, when I look back on when you have opportunities like this, you're speaking to people are reading the books like through a slightly different lens to what you've written, and it's so fascinating because it brings up different resonances, and with the Ends of the Earth, just like talking about work, because it is a big theme in the novel. Mary does various different roles, and part of Jim's disappearance, I suppose you could say, is kind of related to his own work. So it's definitely given me a lot of food for thought. And sometimes you think, like, was I thinking about these ideas that we're now having about the pandemic before it happened? Yeah. You know, like what is a good life? You know, how much should a career fulfill your life, and how much should come from other things? And we're only just having these conversations like in a more complex way now with that thing that's happened.
For sure.
I'm definitely going to look that up. That sounds really good.
I recommend. So the next question that I have for you is a bit of a spoiler. So I'm going to put on the screen the next timestamp to skip to if you don't want any spoilers. Why did you choose to make Ted the one calling her at the crisis centre? That was a bit of a twist for me. That I was like, oh, I didn't see that coming at all. I didn't see any hints of it or anything. Why?
Oh, okay. This is a very good question. I'm glad that it came as a twist. My idea when I started writing the novel, and I knew that in the first chapter Mary would get a call from the man who she believes is Jim, I knew almost immediately that I didn't want it to be Jim on the other end of the phone. I think because I wanted to show the depths of Mary's desperation, because she's kind of clutching at straws, her denial, her wishful thinking, and obviously her immediately clinging to this one theory shows that. then obviously I had the tricky question of like, if not Jim, then who?
Yeah.
Because she has quite a small life, you know, a small coaching friend. And then I suppose from there I sort of had to dig into the logistics, like who would be able to call this anonymous telephone line with no one, you know, who would know the number, who would find her. And then the idea of Ted came out. I think I just layered him in as someone who had lost a spouse. And then as I was writing the novel and some of the themes were coming out, I was like, whoa, okay, so this would play into the theme of people behaving in a way that might look very strange to other people, but until you're in someone's exact situation, you don't know the length they'd go to. So for a lot of people would say, like, why would Mary stand outside with a stranger? It looks strange to other people. And likewise with Ted, why is he calling this anonymous line? Well, it looks strange to other people, but it's the depth of his despair. So those were all the reasons that like layered into Ted. It was hard to write insofar that I really didn't want him to seem a villain. Like, he's not pranking her. Like, one thing I learned in researching kind of anonymous phone lines is like how many prank calls they get, which is kind of sick when you think that, you know, these services are designed for people who really need to get through and then people are pranked. So I didn't want it to be that at all. So it was hard to write that, to kind of make sure that Ted wasn't a villain. He was, nor was he wholly a victim. It's a really fine balance to tread and a fine balance to write. But also, I kind of love a midway. That's my
a little plot twist.
It's funny. In my first novel, there's a big kind of halfway split in the silent treatment. And so with this novel, it's a different kind of twist, but it felt really, I like it. It just kind of brings something to the reading experience as well. If you hit halfway through the book and you're like, whoa, this is going in a different way then. Yeah, for sure. And I when I was reading it as a reader, I didn't initially see him as a villain. I thought, oh, for goodness sake, like, why has he done that sort of thing? But then it kind of explains in the book, he didn't say he was Jim or anything like that he wasn't lying to her. It's kind of the way that she interpreted it, and then he kind of went along with it, and then that's how it happened. So I don't think necessarily anyone's to blame there, but it was a very interesting part of the story. Getting it over your head as well, like, that's definitely something he does. It's like, he phones first time, clearly realises he's made a mistake, and then he like says that he phones to try and apologise, and he does, you know, you hear him saying sorry, but obviously she interrupts it something else. And I think that's definitely a theme in like all my writing, is like people getting in over their head. Like, we all have a plan maybe for the next step, but then it just escalates, and then you have to sort of how do you cope with that? When do you know to pull the plug? Yeah, for sure. And my next one is kind of a spoiler as well, but did you have any other possibilities for where Jim could be? Because initially when I sort of was reading about that phone call and it being Ted, I was certain it was Jim. So I was like, okay, he's still alive, he's calling her. I was thinking something's happened to him because he's sort of apologising and that, and I was like, what's happened to him? But we find out it's something else that happens. What other possibilities were there, did you have, or did you know exactly that's how it's going to end up? Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So yeah, probably a big spoiler in my life too. I always knew that I wanted Jim to be alive and well. I thought the prospect of us ending the book with him being no more, having died for whatever reason, would just be like too much to bear. Particularly because a lot of the book is sort of dealing with, if you spoke about grief and loss. So I always knew that he was going to be alive and well. I also always knew that he wasn't going to come back. I really didn't want this story where someone went off and they found him and they brought him back, like, hurrah, he's not a sort of leopard in a zoo or anything. Like, he is a human who has had a deeply complex history, as had Mary. I didn't want that. So I've sort of got like a sketch of like what possibilities could have happened. When you talk about something having happened to him, like, I did think about him having maybe been involved in like a crime, in jail, on the run. I thought about like a lot of those things, but in all the ways I sketched them, it just seemed a bit sensationalist. So I stripped that back, and then I actually the reason I settled on why Jim has gone actually was just informed by the research that I did into missing people's cases, which is very heart-rendering and fascinating and probably under-discussed socially. Huge amount of people go missing, predominantly men. If anyone's kind of interested, by the way, there's a brilliant podcast series that's presented by Pandora Sykes in conjunction with a UK charity called Missing People UK, and it's called The Missing, and every episode focuses on a different missing person. And it's really illuminating, particularly in terms of the focus on the people left behind, which is obviously why I'm kind of interested in it. But anyway, from this research, I looked a lot into why people go missing, in particular, why men, and mental health is a huge theme, kind of almost like a drumbeat through that. So when I did that research, I thought, this is what's going to feel authentic. And I think that's the most important thing for me when I write about difficult topics. It's just that they need to feel authentic to me and not sensationalist. So yeah, I did have a few other ideas, but that's how I pinned down what did happen to Jim.
Yeah. And I think, like you're saying, you know, you didn't want him to come back to her and all this and it be sort of happy ever after. And I kind of love that because it makes it all that more realistic. You read this book and you're like, it's believable, this totally could happen. So I personally really liked how it ended up. And you mentioned just then about men's mental health playing a huge part in the book. Was that intentional from the start?
Yeah, that's a really brilliant question. It was, as soon as I knew where Jim had gone, because of the research I'd done, I knew that that I'd have to handle Jim's storyline very carefully and really root that in a way that felt realistic. From there, then I suppose at the point of the Ted story entering more dominantly, I suppose then we have that second strand, and then there's a third strand with Kit, who is one of the sort of, I suppose, call him a secondary character, but I completely adore him. He was my favourite to write. And in the sort of late scenes, there's a couple of kind of reveals relating to his character. And it was actually still at that point, I wasn't thinking this is a novel about men's mental health. I think I was writing about denial and depression and moving forward and constancy and patience. I was writing about all these things, but I wasn't thinking, I'm writing about men's mental health. Partly because I think as a woman, it probably wouldn't have been something I naturally gravitated towards. But actually, when I sent the first draft to my editor, one of her first comments was how much she loved the theme of men's mental health running through it, particularly because it felt so original and like it hadn't been done very much. And I was suddenly thinking, oh yeah, so it was actually really, I've got to credit my editor at Penguin, Emily Griffin, who helped me bring that out, because I never want, one thing I'm really keen for is that my writing never feels like preachy. Like I don't like, I love exploring these things, but I never want to like force my reader to a point. Sure. Like if they come to that point, brilliant, but I'm not going to like hold the horse down kind of thing, you know. I feel like take the horse to water, see what they want to do. So it was a real balance, and I wanted that theme to come out, but I didn't want it to feel like, you know, you're being clanged over the head with a big kind of frying pan full of points. So yeah, that was the thought behind that. But a lot of the response I've had from readers and reviewers, it's been incredibly positive on that point. So while I may not have set out to do it, I am now really glad that I have, and particularly if it's resonated in a positive way.
Yeah, for sure, and I absolutely agree that it does. So my last question to you is more of a personal one, and you kind of, by the sounds of it, had a lot of goals for this book, but what did you and do you want to kind of achieve from this book?
So hard to answer. I suppose I love it to just be memorable. I think that with all my books. I'd love them just to be memorable to readers, whether that's because it's characters they haven't read before, a plot that kept them turning the pages, themes that were really thought-provoking, or even just if it took them away during like a really difficult period. So that's always my aim, is to write a book that's memorable. And I think I say that as well because it allows me to do more things. Like if I want to write like a super entertaining book, brilliant. If I want to write a book that's a real tearjerker, like brilliant. But really just to write a book that's memorable, so that readers kind of, if they turn the last page at the end of the earth and they think, oh, like I'm going to think about that next time I'm at Ealing, or I'm going to recommend that to my book group or whatever. That's really the end goal, and a lot of blood, sweat and tears goes into writing a book and publishing a book. Really, publishers do work really hard. So for those moments when I get like an email where someone says this really changed my mind about X or really took me away, that's the reason I do it.
Yeah, perfect. And for me especially, it's obviously worked out really, really well. So thank you for writing it, and obviously thank you for answering my questions.